Hello. Today's talk is about the Interurban Railway that ran from Holland to Saugatuck between 1899 and 1926. The Interurban was an electric railway that linked three cities and connected a lot of rural communities. It ran for 27 years. It stopped 100 years ago. Today, I hope to give you a sense of how it got started, how it operated, who it served, and why it closed down. I'm not going to dwell on details, so if you're a big railroad enthusiast who's looking for lots of special numbers and specific names of train cars, this is probably not what you're looking for. Just a note too, many of the pictures that you'll see were made or enhanced with artificial intelligence. This is my brother in our tree fort in Rochester, New York when we were growing up. We used to sit out there when we were kids and wave at the engineer a few feet away on the New York Central trains that went by on the tracks you can see there. This is a map of the area I grew up in before my street existed. Here's where my house would be, and the New York Central ran to the east over here, and the Erie Canal ran to the west. In the 1920s, the canal was replaced by an interurban train. I was 2 years old when that line closed down, but they tell me I rode it at least once. Before I started high school, this, where the canal was, and then the interurban, became an interstate, and the New York Central rail bed on the other side is now a hiking trail. It's like we were surrounded by the history of mass transportation. I'm not a railroad fanatic, but I've always loved trains. I had my first steam train ride here when I was probably about 8 or 9 years old in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. And this is Bainbridge, New York, where I had my first job. We lived about, maybe 100 yards from the railroad tracks. I've always lived, it seems, where I could at least hear a railroad. But enough about me. Let's start talking about what led up to the beginning of the interurban in Saugatuck and Holland. What kinds of things came together in the late 1800s to make interurban railways possible? Well, electric train engines hit the scene in the 1870s, but electric power wasn't commercially available until the 1880s, when power stations like Thomas Edison's in New York City, that you see in the picture here, began to appear. Cities really wanted trains, but not those smoky steam engines. Urban electric trolleys debuted in 1888, and this is a photograph of one of those, and they evolved very quickly. They were fast, quiet, clean, and relatively cheap to operate. The rise of tourism was another late century phenomenon. Tourism used to be something that only rich people could do, but that was changing fast. In the late 1800s, there was more leisure time. New labor laws meant that people had shorter work weeks, so rather than just having maybe one day off, they would have a day and a half. Saturday afternoon was free. And many people started to have paid vacations of a week or two long. This chart shows how U.S. economic output really grew incredibly quickly after the Civil War. You can see that between 1870 and 1901, the per capita GNP more than doubled. So lots of stuff was happening. There were new jobs that paid well, and people just had money, disposable money. On top of that, advances in mass transportation, like steamships, made short trips more affordable. These large ships could put lots of people on them, and then the individual fares for the individual people were affordable. Doctors were also telling people to get away from the bad air of the city. Of course, entrepreneurs took advantage of these trends. So those steamship lines that you saw before, those were getting creative and they were connecting with the new trains to get people from a lake port to a land destination so that people not only could get to the city, but from the city they could take a train and get farther inland. So they were more interested in the steamships. A real estate developer who created a resort or started a condo, not a condo, but a cottage development area, could help finance a train that would take people to that area. So people could get from a large city to a smaller port, and from there they could get to this new resort or this area where there were cottages. Banks and investors were just pouring money into the interurbans. People really thought that electric railways would transform transportation. So here specifically, how did things get started? By 1897, the technology existed, tourists were traveling, and investors were really seeing the opportunities here. Into that mix stepped a man named Charles Humphrey. He had lived in the UP up in Ironwood, which you can see the little map of there, and he had a connection with Allegan County. He was the city attorney for the city of Ironwood, as you again from the map there, and he was also the attorney for an iron mining company up there. He had already helped organize, legalize, and manage an electric railway. He was just the guy to get things going in Holland and Saugatuck. And Humphrey brought with him a man named Melvin Kinch from Ironwood. Kinch was an experienced railway superintendent already, and so he came down and he was the guy who ran the day-to-day operations. He was very popular with the locals. In 1890, before this actually, before the time that we're going to talk about in a second, there was a group, the Chicago and West Michigan Railroad, that wanted to send a steam train from Holland to Macatawa Park. And for those of you not familiar with the area, Macatawa Park is right at the mouth of the river, the mouth of the Macatawa River, or the Black River as it was called in the time. So there's an area right there that was called Macatawa Park. Well, these people that wanted to send the steam train there didn't work. The folks at Macatawa Park weren't interested at the time. Instead, they built a spur of the train from Holland on the north side, and they created, the same people who built the line, built this beautiful, huge Ottawa Beach hotel. Well, the folks who owned the Macatawa Hotel on the other side of the lake soon realized they were missing out big time. And this was all the time, this was at the time when electric railroads were coming into their own. So across the way was a steam train, but it was only a matter of time before investors would move forward with an electric train that would go out to Macatawa Park. Work on that electric railway in Holland began in 1897, but it soon stopped because the contractor ran out of money. It's not clear to me whether the contractor didn't manage things well or the people who were running the railroad just had no idea how much money they needed to get started. Well, it took a few months, but they were able to bring in a new money man named James Cochran, a Pennsylvanian who had made a fortune in the lumber industry. He came and he paid the bills and must have also taken a large share of the ownership of the new line, and they began laying track again. The line opened on June 27, 1898, and the fare was 5 cents within the city. I believe it was 5 cents just within the city of Holland, so if you wanted to get out to Macatawa Park, you had to pay another 5 cents. Planning for the Saugatuck line, which was all part of the same project really, started in February of 1898 with a capital outlay of $120,000. That's $4.5 million in today's money, which kind of sounds like a lot, but when you think about what they were doing, it's not crazy. It took longer than expected to secure all the rights of way, the permission to lay the tracks on all that private property. So work on the line didn't actually begin until November of 1898, and the first cars ran on to Saugatuck on August 19th, 1899. Thousands of people that day attended a big train day celebration. Charles Humphrey was the first president for both lines, and Melvin Kinch, he was the superintendent. This is a 1902 schedule, so a very early schedule of the line, and it includes the Grand Rapids part that we're going to talk about in a second. But you can see that the first car is leaving Saugatuck at 6 a.m., and the last one arrives at 11 p.m., and there was a train every hour. So this was not a trivial thing. There were lots of trains going back and forth. It was 11 miles to Macatawa Park, and the train took about 25 minutes. If you look really carefully, you can see the schedule makes it look like it took them 18 minutes, and that just seems way too fast for a train that was going 11 miles at the time, but it's possible. Individual cars ran, and they held 40 to 60 people. They sent them individually a couple of minutes apart. Typically, only one or two cars ran at a time, and that depended on the demand. There were more cars if they were picking up passengers from a ship. In 1898, a different group proposed an interurban between Saugatuck and South Haven, and here you can see a map of how they might have crossed Douglas. This group wasn't able to make things happen. They were still talking about this line 10 years later in 1908, but they never got any tracks on the ground. From the beginning, the hope was that the line would eventually run from Holland to Grand Rapids as well. In 1900, investors from Detroit bought the two existing lines, and we're going to see how that works out when we look at the names of the lines in a minute. So they bought the two existing lines, and the new president was a man from Detroit named John Winter. A man named Benjamin Hanchett was vice president, and he's going to come back frequently in our little story, so more on him later. This photo shows workers building an underpass below the Père Marquette steam train line in Holland. The steam trains were the big deal at the time, so if the two lines had to cross, it was up to the electric line to figure out how to get under the steam line. The steam line wasn't going to sort of get out of the way. On July 9th, 1901, the first cars began running to Grand Rapids, and the new line added 26 miles to the system that was already there, so more than doubled how much track was in this new railway line. And from the beginning of all of this, a huge plus was the partnership that the line had with the Graham and Morton steamship line. They were based in Benton Harbor, but this is their dock in Chicago. And again, this is one of those photos that's colorized. Did a really nice job, huh? In 1899, the Interurban installed tracks on the Macatawa Park steamship dock. So the people in Macatawa Park had already built a steamship dock at that time, so the ships were already coming in. And you can see the tracks across at Ottawa Beach. So the steam trains were coming in at Ottawa Beach Hotel up to the north, and on that you can see the red line showing how far out into the water this dock extended. This is one of my favorite photos, right, because you can really clearly see how the passengers could come in on the ships, and this one I think was one called the Puritan. The passengers could get off the ship, and just in a few steps they just hop on the train and off they go. They could go into Holland, they could go up to Grand Rapids, they could go down to Saugatuck, and vice versa. If they were headed back, they would get on the train and stop at the dock, and there they were at the ship. You could go from Chicago to Grand Rapids in 7 hours, and this partnership ended up to be quite lucrative for everybody involved. As an example, on the 4th of July in 1913, 1,800 people arrived by ship. So lots of folks using this line. In 1902, the line was reorganized and Benjamin Hanchett became president. Don't get too excited because it doesn't last very long. A lifelong resident of Grand Rapids, Hanchett had been involved with railroads since he was 14. His mother was Betsy Jennison, part of a family that had been very successful in the lumber business. The Jennison family had bought land early and they had harvested lumber, and then they got into a grist mill, so they were very successful. Benjamin's uncles were Lucius and Luman Jennison. How could you not love those two faces? I just love this portrait. Lucius and Luman owned the Shadyside Resort west of Holland, and that soon became known as Jennison Park. It had a hotel, a dock, a dance hall, a large green space, and they also had cottage lots for sale. Benjamin Hanchett, their nephew, inherited all of that in 1903. Now in 1904, a new railway was formed and Hanchett was out. But don't feel bad for him. He still ran the trolleys in the city of Grand Rapids, and he was still an important figure. We'll come back to him very soon. So here's how the name of the Interurban evolved, and you can kind of see how the pieces are fitting together. In 1898, the Holland and Lake Michigan Railway was started. In 1899, the Saugatuck-Douglas and Lakeshore Electric Railway were started. It looks like they're two lines, and technically they were, but it was the same people running both of them. In 1901, they had the new owners who bought the two railroads, and they added the Grand Rapids line, and they changed the name to the Grand Rapids, Holland, and Lake Michigan Rapid Railway. In a couple of years, right, new owners, new setup, and it's called the Grand Rapids, Holland, and Chicago Railway. And that's the name that stuck for most of the time that this interurban was going. Even in 1916, when the line was bought out by the Michigan United Railways that we'll hear about later, even then it was still called the JR-H&C. This was the route from Holland to Grand Rapids. This is an important part of the system, but I'm just going to concentrate today on what happened between Macatawa Park and Saugatuck. Here's an overview of the route. The trains went from Holland all the way over to Macatawa Park, and then they came back to Saugatuck Junction and headed south. Here's kind of an overview of where the route went. Later I'll show you a more detailed map that shows all the stops when the line was more mature. The train, when it got down to Saugatuck, entered on a trestle over what's now North Street. There was a nasty wetland there at Goshorn Creek, and a trestle was easier to build, evidently, than an embankment. In other words, rather than putting lots of dirt in there, it was easier to just build a wooden trestle at the time. Here's what the trestle looked like. This is the one really good picture that we have of it, right? And this is my take on what it would look like if it was overlaid on the modern landscape of things. So this is North Street in the front and Maple Street going off to the right. And in the background, off to the right at the top there, is the Blue Star Highway. And the scale is about right? The trains were about that size. The train made a couple of turns in Saugatuck, and it ended up in front of the Butler Hotel. There was a turnaround loop next to the Interurban station. And so you can see the Interurban station to the right here, and you can kind of see the loop there. So these people are waiting for a train. This photo was taken from the Butler Hotel. This bird's eye view map does a really nice job of showing what the route looked like and how the loop came in. You can see the Leyendecker Hotel and the ships coming in. You can see the Butler Hotel down at the bottom. You can also see there's a couple of little spurs that are coming off and going to places where there was a lumber mill and a freight depot. This last photo, I just love this. This last photo shows the end of the line in Saugatuck, and you can see on the left the transit freight office, so the ticket office, and in front of it is a taxi that's waiting to take people to Douglas. I think this is around 1910. And on the right side is the Butler Hotel. So how did all of this actually work? How did things actually function technologically? Well, there was no public electric service in Saugatuck until after, I believe, until after the pump station went in, until after the big pavilion went in. So they would have had to wait quite a while for public service in Saugatuck. And there was some electric service in Holland, but it didn't generate enough power to run a railroad, so the Interurban built its own power station and generated its own 600 volts of current. I believe this is a modernized power station, not the original one, but it gives you an idea what it might have looked like inside. The power station was at Virginia Park, about 2 miles west, that would have been east of Macatawa Park, and they burned coal to produce steam. The steam drove the generators, and off you went. One power station served the entire line. The tracks were standard gauge. This wasn't a small gauge railroad. That allowed the interurbans to use freight cars from the steam railroads. So the steam railroad that was coming into Holland might bring in a freight car, and they could attach it to an electric engine that could take the freight from Holland down to Saugatuck, for example. They used steel rails that could support heavy loads of fruit and other products. Here's an interesting statistic that's not entirely random. During each of the peak years of this railroad system, from Saugatuck up to Grand Rapids, the line sold more than 1 million tickets. That's a lot. Yet over 27 years, only one person was ever killed on an interurban accident between Holland and Saugatuck. One is too many, but it's pretty remarkable that there were so few fatal accidents. There were others on the rest of the line, but only one between Holland and Saugatuck. Most interurban cars ran on 2 trucks, like the one you see in this drawing, that pivoted on a kingpin independently of the car body. So you had the car body was kind of like this long sort of shoeboxy thing, and underneath it were these trucks that moved independently. I didn't really know what a truck was until I did the research for this presentation, and it's very interesting. Each truck had 4 wheels, 2 axles connected to motors, a suspension system, and a braking system. This photo is from about 1908. So those trucks they turned independently of the car up above. So if you came to a sharp corner, right, the whole train didn't have to go straight. One truck could turn and the other one could go straight. The electric motors provided maximum torque, maximum speed right away. So unlike steam engines, they could start very quickly from a dead stop, and they could also brake quickly. That made them able to make more stops in a shorter time, which was great for these interurban railroads that were making lots of short stops in the rural areas. Well, what about the cars? The cars were self-contained. There was no separate engine pulling things, right? You had those trucks with the motors underneath. A typical speed in the countryside was 30 miles an hour, but I believe they went a bit faster than that. It was much slower in the city. I think the original speed limit in Holland was 8 miles an hour. And inside the car, a motorman controlled the voltage that went to the motors. So that's how they regulated the speed. There were no gears to shift. The interior was heated, and there were reversible seats. Some cars had baggage areas and smoking compartments. This one didn't, but some others did. In the winter, the snow had to be cleared from the tracks. So here's a drawing of the kind of car that they actually had to clear the tracks. So what did it look like? What did it smell like? What did it sound like? Well, the wooden exteriors were originally painted red with a yellow roof. But in 1914, when they became part of the Michigan United system, the cars were painted green with a red roof, kind of like this. The owners must have been fans of Michigan State, not the University of Michigan. The passing of an interurban train, left a scent of ozone and hot grease, and overhead wires were hissing as the train arrived, and you could hear the steel rails clattering on the rails there. A compressed air whistle warned people of a train's arrival, and that set of signals is the same signal they use in modern trains, two long, one short, one long, to let people know that a train is coming. So who used these trains? Well, overall, they provided quick transportation between two ports on the lake, rural areas, small towns, and a rather large city. Sure, the urban distributed tourists all over the place. That's kind of one of the obvious uses for it. But it was also helpful to the folks who already lived here. People could easily travel between Grand Rapids, Holland, and Saugatuck. People from Grand Rapids could get to the cottage on the lake shore, or something more challenging. People from Chicago could get to a hotel like the Macatawa or Leindecker's in Saugatuck. And so here you can see the hotel that later became known as the Columbia and had other names after that. This is obviously after 1909 because you can see the big pavilion in the back. The privately owned Belvedere Estate had its own stop. The Belvedere is now a venue for weddings. So if you have a wedding that would like to have its own private estate and grounds and so forth, it's a nice looking spot. People could also access entertainment anywhere along the route. So folks from Grand Rapids could get to the beach in Saugatuck. Folks from Saugatuck could go to a play in Grand Rapids. You could go shopping in Grand Rapids. This is downtown Grand Rapids in 1908. And new attractions were created just for tourists, of course. This is Angel's Flight, an inclined railway in Macatawa Park. For about 10 cents, you could, which would translate into $3.50 today, you were taken to a lookout pavilion at the top with a beautiful view, and there was a dance floor and an ice cream parlor. Let's get back to our friend Benjamin Henchett. He turned his Jenison Park property into an amusement park, and it was aimed very specifically at passengers on the Interurban. Jenison Park had a roller coaster, an air swing, a whirlpool, that was a water ride, a maze. They had electric lights at night and a merry-go-round. And later he added pony rides and a miniature train and a shooting gallery and a theater with vaudeville acts. So there was a lot going on at this Jenison Electric Park. It was called Jenison Electric Park. They even had indoor baseball games. If you're curious, this is a great book about the park. It's colorful, it's well written, it's got some fun stories. It's a wonderful little book. In Holland proper, and that's a deliberate double entendre there, blue laws were an obstacle on Sundays. This sign is actually from Ontario, Canada in 1911, but the rules were pretty much the same. right? Businesses were supposed to be closed. There were not going to be any sports matches. There were not supposed to be sports matches or dancing or shows or excursions. And of course, consuming alcohol in public was a no-no. Fortunately, Jennison Park was outside of Holland, and the rules were different. In spite of that, they made a point to stress wholesome family entertainment, but there was always friction with the city. In 1909, the big pavilion opened in Saugatuck, and the interurban stopped right there. In fact, the loop is not very far past the left side of this picture at the end of the line. In one evening at the big pavilion, they had 1,800 paid admissions. A lot of people used the interurban to get to the big pavilion. So the interurban made the big pavilion a success in one sense, and the big pavilion helped make the interurban a success. You could also get to the big pavilion by ship, but those ships were not terribly reliable. They'd run for 2 years and then they'd stop, and then they'd run for 2 years and then they'd stop. This was because the river was not terribly dependable. When the line first opened, you had the old channel, which meant that people had to come in and they had to turn and go north, and then they had to turn around and go south, right? So it was a long way from the mouth of the river to Saugatuck, a relatively long way. And so that you had to have a deep enough water, right? And so if the water level was down, it was hard to get in. And sometimes there was sediment. In 1906, they opened up the new channel, which made things a little bit better, but it was still a problem. The water depth was still a problem. On the other hand, in Holland, they had a full commercial harbor, right? They had federal help to dredge and dig it deeper, so it was dependably deep enough for the shipping lines, and the ships there came very regularly. Freight was a major source of income for the line. It accounted for 30% of the revenue in 1908. That was more than what I expected. They used closed freight cars like this one, just a standard freight car, and open-topped gondolas. I don't believe that these had their own engines, so they had to have a locomotive to pull them, and they did have an electric locomotive. They frequently carried fruit and farm products. Now these first two pictures were not actually Saugatuck. They were more to give you a sense of what the type of car looked like. But this is actually on the line in Saugatuck, and they are loading apples onto a train. This is approximately 1918. You can tell by the name Michigan Railway. And behind this first car is one that is labeled refrigerator. That car was insulated, and they used ice inside to pack the items and keep them cold. In fact, the first one might be the same kind of thing. They didn't have actual electrical refrigeration yet, but this was another effective way to keep things cool. These trains carried other items too, including the occasional coffin. They carried the U.S. mail for a time, but there was at least one incident where the mail was not arriving on time and people were not happy. So I'm not sure how often they did carry the mail. We also know that students from Gibson used the train to get to school in Saugatuck. The interurban success was not guaranteed. Transportation was changing, so it was time for the line to make some changes. In 1912, our old friend Benjamin Hanchett bought the railroad and began to implement improvements. In 1913, there was a new dock, and guess where it was? Right next to Jennison Park, which Mr. Hanchett owned. That meant no more rent to the folks in Macatawa Park. So the folks in Macatawa Park, the people who owned it, were actually charging them rent to use their dock. So here, if you remember how things were before, the line in Macatawa Park actually went out a little bit farther. Now it stops shorter, and there's a new dock right next to the park, And you can see it's very nicely set up with separate lines and all. And the new route goes straight south from this Jenison Park, Macatawa Park. So it doesn't have to go back to Saugatuck Junction anymore. So this is very good for the folks in Saugatuck. It also connected to new property developments like Castle Park, which became a thing in around 1912. It existed before that, but they were starting to sell property there at about that time. Here you can see grading work for the new track down in Saugatuck, and back in the background is the trestle. This is like the best photograph that shows the overall view of the trestle. In fact, there's only 3 pictures that I found that show the trestle at all. There's one close-up that we saw before, and there's one where you could just barely see it in the distance. The trestle was taken down eventually. I'm not sure if it was done right in 1913 or not. Current on the route to Saugatuck was doubled to 1200 volts. So the cars could go faster, they could pull heavier things, but only the new cars were able to handle this voltage. And so this is an example. This car 23 was one of those newer cars at the time. Here's a more detailed map of what the route looked like after 1913. So the old route, the parts that were eliminated are in green. So Saugatuck Junction is gone. It stops going through Grafskap. And the purple line is what's new. So the Interurban dock you can see is in purple, whereas the old loop in Macatawa is green. All of these stations are my educated guesses at where the wait stations were located. Some of them are, I'm quite sure, are accurate. The rest are just good guesses. So you can see Castle Park, several other stops here. Here's Lake Town, and there's the Gibson stop at the bottom. Farview. Some of you know about Farview Park. This is right about where the entrance to Farview Park is now. And there's the Belvedere. There was a place called Whitney's Corners where it makes this hard 90-degree turn, and there was a little spur there. And you can see the trestle at the side. And here you can see how the route changed. The purple line there goes through Peterson Nature Preserve. So you can walk down that. We'll see a picture of that later. And you have Wilson's Dock, which was another spot on the route. So why don't we still have an interurban train? Well, there are lots of reasons. The biggest one was the advent of motor vehicles. And they had one major inherent advantage. The government was paying for their roads. The trains had to make their own roads and maintain them. In 1900, Michigan had mostly dirt roads, like here in Douglas in the photo, and some of them were covered in gravel or crushed stone, but very few were actually what we would call paved. Soon, more and more roads were paved. Center Street in Douglas was paved in 1911. At first, there weren't a lot of cars to compete with. There were some, even in 1900, but between 1900 and 1910, the number of cars multiplied by 10, and the price dropped by a third. Very soon, though, in 1913, Ford rolled out the Model T assembly line, and prices dropped dramatically again. So it was cheaper and cheaper to buy a car. Trucks had a similar growth rate. They didn't require extensive infrastructure or power lines. They needed gas, right? So they had to have gas stations, but not much infrastructure. And they could carry freight anywhere there was a road. There were more and more motor vehicles being produced, to the point where in 1926, in 1 year, they made 4 million new motor vehicles. And again, the prices got less and less, so they were very affordable. Motor vehicles could also carry large groups of people. This is in Douglas, right? You can see the taxi that we saw before. And so there was taxi service even in Douglas. This is, again, I think this is about 1910. The first public gas-powered bus service was in New York City in 1905. And of course, there was the Greyhound buses, which started way back in 1914. And by the end of, by the time the Interurban came down, they were running to Saugatuck. Cities and towns gradually replaced their electric trains with buses. There were several factors besides the motor vehicles. One of them was World War II. World War II created shortages. This poster talks about coal, but there were also shortages in copper wire and steel rails. Since they were hard to come by, it was hard to do any new railroad construction or even maintenance. On top of that, lots of workers left the railroad to join the military or work in factories. And as railroad traffic got bogged down with all this new demand, there were the trucks to fill in the gaps. The sale of alcohol was a draw for all the amusement venues and the hotels on these routes. So it didn't help when Michigan passed prohibition in 1918 ahead of the federal prohibition. And finally, the Blue Law issue came to a head. After years of religious protest, in 1922, the Park Township Board of Trustees ordered all amusements to close on Sundays, and that more or less put Jenison Park out of business. The Interurban was struggling. In 1924, the GRH&C was separated from its parent company, and that took away their financial backing and a lot of the resources that they needed to operate. That year, there were only 2 daily runs from Holland to Saugatuck, no more once an hour, just 2 a day. The line suddenly declared bankruptcy. The last local Interurban was run on Monday, November 15th, 1926. Ours wasn't the only line in trouble. Once there were over 250 interurban lines. Today, the South Shore line from Chicago to South Bend is one of only 3 remaining interurban lines in the USA. So what's left of the old Interurban? Well, in 1927, Ed Force bought the station at the corner of Butler and Culver Streets. He turned it into Snug Harbor, a filling station and a bus stop that a lot of folks still remember in the area. It came down in about 2000, and the current building is this one. And so you can kind of imagine where the station was. Behind it, right about in the middle, is the Butler restaurant now, which is more or less where the old Butler Hotel used to stand. Consumers Energy more or less inherited all of those power lines, right? There they were, these lines running electricity up and down between Saugatuck and Holland and then up to Grand Rapids. The tracks weren't necessary anymore, but those power lines could share the power that was produced and get it out into the towns and so forth. And so this electric company took it all over. And those lines, you can still see them. A lot of it you can see on Google Maps. If you were to go and look at the satellite view, you can see this. This is Peterson Preserve in Saugatuck. So there's a trail there that follows that new route that was laid in 1913 up to North Street. This is a private street off 66th up across from Castle Park, not too far from Macatawa Park, and they called their street the Old Interurban Drive. So the route went along this way. Sanctuary Woods, another Laketown Township park, has a piece of the original Interurban bridge, and I'm told it actually has a piece of the original track embedded in there as well. The information booth in Saugatuck near the Butler was a wait station. It was moved there a while back. And Fairview Park has a wait station. Maybe it was the one that was at Fairview. We don't really know. and that's at the entrance to this Laketown Township Park. But is it really gone? As a child, I rode an interurban that was making its final run. I was born way too late to ride the one in Saugatuck. A century later, its route still shapes our landscape, and its work continues through the interurban bus service. The end of the line was not really the end of the story. Thank you.